Whenever people find out I'm a historian, a lot of times they'll launch into a laundry list of facts that they know. Maybe they'll tell me they can list all the presidents in order, or that they can recite the preamble to the Constitution. Shout out Schoolhouse Rock. And to that I say, so what? Listen, I love trivia as much as the next person. Actually, no, I love trivia way more than the next person. But that's not what history is. Reciting names and dates and facts with no sense of what it all means. In fact, thinking like a historian has almost nothing to do with memorization. I have a terrible memory, which is ironic as someone whose entire job is telling people about the past, but it's okay, because true history and meaningful historical thinking is way more about the way you analyze and understand the past than just remembering everything that happened, which is really boring and impossible, by the way. And luckily, pretty much all historical thinking can be shoved into one of 5 categories, what I call the 5 C's of historical thinking. Basically, every essay, article, book, documentary, whatever, that is trying to explain history in some way is using one, or often more, of these 5 skills. That's it. And knowing how to spot and apply these ways of thinking will be way more helpful to you out in the real world than knowing the date of the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, that's what Google is for. It's 1803, by the way. So whenever you're studying history, whether it's watching a documentary, reading a book, or singing along to a founding father-themed musical, be on the lookout for the 5 C's. First up, causation. Now, most people think history is all just causation, an order of events. One thing leads to another, which leads to another. And it's true that this is the most basic of all the skills, and it's also sometimes the most intuitive. Like, we like when things have a clear beginning, middle, and end. But consider that causation often spans decades or centuries and is more like branches of a tree than a singular timeline. For example, how did the poisoning of Genghis Khan's father lead to Christopher Columbus landing in Cuba thinking it was India? Those 2 events are directly connected by causation. If Genghis Khan hadn't risen up and created the largest contiguous empire in world history, connecting the trade routes from East Asia and the innovations of China all the way to medieval Europe, then we could argue that medieval Europe might not have come out of its dark ages at that time. They might not have gotten access to the tools that are going to help them expand and spread around the world. The Mongol Empire also contributes to the thriving trade in both the Asian landmass and the Indian Ocean that is part of the reason why so many Europeans are so motivated to find other routes to get there, thus going westward and hoping for the best. If you're reading the news and trying to understand an event right now, sometimes you can just go back a few weeks or months or years. Sometimes you might want to go back decades or centuries to fully understand how and why we got here. Now, the next of the C's is comparison. Again, this skill seems fairly straightforward, and it sometimes is, but where it gets interesting and useful is when you get into the how and why 2 or more things are similar or different. For example, we might be comparing the North and the South on the eve of the Civil War. And sure, we can list out that the North had most of the industrial strengths, while the South was fighting to preserve their land and way of life, including an economic system built on the backs of enslaved people. But do we know why they had these economic differences that are going to influence the outcome of the war? And what did they have in common that kept them together for almost 100 years before devolving into civil war? Those questions are more important to answer than just listing out how many miles of railroad track the North had. If you're really in the know, you'll refer to this next skill as CCOT. History is often about change and continuity over time. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And we often like to think that what's going on in our lives, our world is unique. It's vastly different or somehow separate from the past, but it's not. We're just living in a moment that is a continuation of the past. And honestly, the more you learn about history, the more you realize that people haven't really changed all that much. It's both sad and comforting at the same time. And this is why it's really important to take note of moments in history when we do change. These are sometimes called watershed or turning point moments in history, and it's something we should always pay attention to. Rome wasn't built in a day, true, but a lot of it was built in a very short period of time under the first Emperor Augustus. So what changed in the long-standing Roman Republic that gave him so much power? Or why did Lincoln shift away from over a century of silence and compromise on slavery to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863? Why him and why then? Or more recently, American attitudes seemed to change very quickly around the status and rights of the LGBTQ community. We had a windfall of Obergefell v. Hodges and Modern Family, but was that really overnight? We should consider the generations of activists who had slowly pushed their cause forward, often working tirelessly and without immediate success, so that Americans could wake up one day to the pride flag projected on the White House. Understanding CCOT helps us see the cumulative effect of millions of individual actions over time, and it can be really inspiring, especially when it feels like one person can't have any sort of impact on the world. History shows us that that's not true. Now, my bread and butter, my favorite of all the skills, is contextualization. And these last two C's are, in my opinion, the most important, especially for non-historians to understand. Context is everything. Nothing is ever as simple or straightforward as it seems at first glance. Like, let's take a topic that seems relatively straightforward, the American Revolution. We'd been abused by the British and forced to pay outrageous taxes and ratcheting up the price of our beloved tea. Except that the taxes were really just to pay off the debt the British had accrued defending us and our land in the French and Indian War. In fact, British citizens back home had been paying much higher taxes for over a century, and they kind of thought we were being babies about the whole thing. Understanding the events that came before the laundry list of taxes makes the whole thing make more sense. And the outrage that led to the famous Boston Tea Party, it was actually because the British had lowered the price of tea. Yeah, a lot of the Bostonian leaders were also making a pretty decent side hustle out of smuggling in tea that was cheaper than the British company tea that we were all supposed to be buying. So the British lowered the taxes on their tea to compete with the black market stuff. That should have made us happy, but cut to the Sons of Liberty dumping tea in the harbor more as a way to intimidate and weaken their economic competitor than anything to do with freedom or taxation without representation. Now, does this context change our overall opinion on the American Revolution? Was it all a lie and we should go beg Britain to take us back? No, not necessarily. The revolution was also about ideals like democracy, equality, and representation in the government. But that's not all it was about, and it's naive to think that there weren't a lot of factors at play. That's context. And this brings us to concurrence, or maybe complexity. Man, there's a lot of alliterative options. Now, this is the hardest skill to teach, and it's also the one most likely to break your brain. At least it happens to me all the time. Concurrence is the idea that a lot of things were happening all over the world at the exact same time. Sometimes they impact each other and can provide context. Like, I don't know, when the American Civil War accidentally destroyed the Egyptian economy by tanking cotton prices. Sorry. And sometimes they're just ships passing in the night, two or more events or people doing their thing at the same time, not realizing that historians later are going to try to make meaning out of it all. It's an idea that I like to sum up in 3 words: time is weird. For example, let's take Galileo, famous scientist, yada, yada, yada. Would it weird you out if I told you that he and Pocahontas were alive at the same time? In fact, Galileo was first presenting his early telescope in Venice the same year that John Smith took over control of the Jamestown colony. And when Pocahontas ended up in England, she likely heard people discussing Galileo's meeting with the Pope over this new Copernican model of the universe. Or maybe she heard the news about the death of William Shakespeare. It's weird to think that these different figures' lives overlapped in some way, right? And we can apply this idea to our own lives to give us some comfort. Like, if you read the news and feel like a lot is happening all at once and it's overwhelming, you're right. But that's also always been the case. So as you explore history or read the news, aka study the real-time history we're currently living through, be on the lookout for the 5 C's. Train your brain to think of events that way, because they're everywhere. And if you come across a topic from the past or a current event that seems perfectly simple and straightforward, think about it like a historian. It's going to make everything more confusing, but it's also going to get you a lot closer to the truth. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.